All right, thank you everybody for joining us. As mentioned, it's great to see so many familiar and new faces as well. Via Zoom, welcome those joining us via Facebook Live. I'm Megan Marshall. I'm the director of the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers series. And this is actually our final event of the spring semester, but we are concluding with a very dynamic author who's sure to give us a lot to think about, some lasting inspiration that's going to take us up until the new series starts in the fall. But before I welcome him to begin, I do want to make sure I thank all of those who have helped to make this series possible this semester. And that includes my wonderful co-host, Markle Tumlin. Appreciate all the time that you've put in to helping us out with this series this semester. I also want to thank Danya Muka-Hall, Laurel Bliss, Jessica Savala, and Rebecca Williamson, as well as the Department of English and Comparative Literature for their continued support of the series. Just a couple reminders. I know for most of you, this is not your first rodeo, but in case you forget, please keep your mic muted during the presentation. And then once the reading portion is concluded, we're going to have time for some questions. And so at that point, you're welcome to unmute yourself, use the little hand raise function and ask a question. And lastly, please check out the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers series on YouTube. On our channel, we have recordings of all of our great events, and we also have creative responses from students who are enrolled in the Living Writers class. And super excited, I'm about to be posting some new content from the students who are enrolled in the class this semester within the next month. So check it out. Lots of good stuff for your viewing pleasure. And then lastly, if you want to keep up with events that are happening in the fall 21 semester, check out the SDSU MFA community webpage. I'll post that link in the chat so that you can keep an eye on what's coming up next semester. All right, well, without further ado, I am honored to introduce our reader, our final reader of the series for the evening. Harold Jaffe is the highly acclaimed author of 29 volumes of fiction, docufiction, and nonfiction, including BRUT, Writings on Art and Artists, from which he'll be reading from tonight, Porn, Anti-Porn, Death Cafe, Revolutionary Brain, Induced Coma, Anti-Twitter, Morning Crazy Horse, Madonna and Other Spectacles, and Dos Indios. His writing has been translated in Turkey, France, Spain, Germany, Romania, Japan, Italy, and Cuba. He is Professor Emeritus at SDSU and Editor-in-Chief of Fiction International. In his newest work, BRUT, Writings on Art and Artists, Jaffe addresses an eclectic range of musicians, writers, painters, philosophers, and outsider artists like Nina Simone, Albert Camus, Vincent van Gogh, James Baldwin, and Sylvia Plath, individuals who enacted a sovereign response to an insupportable world, with prose that is attuned to the heart-mind while cognizant of its inevitable demise, a center that cannot hold. Of the book, author Larry Foundation proclaims, BRUT broadcasts the vision of a master conjurer, a writer who sees through walls, who dismantles both assumed truths and false truths, who celebrates the dialectic of creation and destruction that is the authentic act of imagination. These biographical vignettes are not just illuminating, but revolutionary. So please join me in welcoming Hal Jaffe.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. I'm thinking that I hope some of you have found time to see the interview conducted by Robert Cross on BRUT on YouTube because it responds to some sort of difficult questions, or he asks questions that point to somewhat difficult aspects of the text, which I respond to. If you have the book, it might help to follow along on the pages, because there are different names in different languages, not that many, but some. Now I'm wondering, I could either ease into this or start with a burst. How would you like me to do it?
I'm thinking we just need a burst.
A burst, okay.
Yeah, unless anyone objects, but I'm feeling the burst right now. I think that might be the way to go.
Glory hole. Glory hole. With your portable drill, drill a hole in any wall erected with hate and suspicion. Thrust your hand through the hole and shake the hand of anyone on the other side who is willing to shake hands. Don't display your face. Stake. First frame. Middle-aged white male, naked from the waist up, lies on his back. He is overweight, has a smartphone attached to his belt, and wears strong cologne. In the middle of his naked, hairless chest is a porterhouse steak. He falls asleep and snores loudly. Second frame. Slender teens in hip-hop outfits enter his space stealthily. They remove the porterhouse steak from his chest and substitute a large graphic photograph of a stock animal being brutally slaughtered. Third frame. The teens are tossing porterhouse steaks from an overhead ramp onto the busy freeway. This one has a little bit of French in it, not much, but it's, the French is translated, love is dead, long live rage in French. You are in Paris. This is called Tuxedo. You are in Paris, Bastille Day. Change into a tuxedo, but first cut off the labels. Take a warm bath while wearing your tuxedo. Walk through the Bastille Quartier in your wet tuxedo without labels, shouting, l'amour est mort, vive la rage. This one's called couvade. It comes from the French word couver, meaning to brood or to hatch, and you'll get the sense of it. Couvade, C-O-U-V-A-D-E. Lie on the shelf above me, experience my labor, and have my baby. After I conceive, we will exchange places and I will experience your labor, have your baby. After we both conceive, we will make love deliriously. This is called Bang Your Head. Bang your head. Access global news on your smartphone in the kitchen. Bang your head once against the wall. Access global news on your smartphone in the living room. Bang your head twice against the wall. Access global news on your smartphone in the bedroom. Bang your head 3 times against the wall. Access global news on your smartphone while sitting on the toilet. Bang your head 4 times against the wall. Get rest, spray on cologne, and go to work. You know, I want to read a series, they're all short, very short, called Queen of Hearts. Robert and I talk about this in the interview. This is an idealized performance artist, a woman who's actually, in a sense, the queen of compassion. And what she does is a very extreme sort of performance She puts herself in position where she's likely to die if people don't gather her up or take her to the hospital. She throws herself from high places. She burns herself, does those kinds of things. And people either help or they let her die. That's the nature of her performance. And there are three, all very short. This is about the ghost dance, an actual thing introduced by a Northern Paiute shaman. And the idea was if you wore a certain jacket, you would be impervious to the cavalry's bullets. The Queen of Hearts was in a cluster of 100 women, each of whom resembled her. They were performing the ghost dance, imagining that it would protect them from the white genociders, even as the mounted US cavalry was advancing. They were all shot dead, but for one who continued to dance faster, faster, with madness in her feet. Her face was a white mask, war-painted with mustangs and buffalo. She ghost danced and refused to die. In my dream, she was the Queen of Hearts. Queen of Hearts. The Queen of Hearts wears camo. Her face is kabuki white. Her clothes and body are slick with gasoline. She lights a Cuban cigar with a table match, then uses the lit cigar to set herself on fire. Ablaze with the cigar in her teeth, she leaps from the roof of the Hotel Teresa onto the burned pavement at 125th Street, Harlem. Nobody sees her or wants to see her. She is beyond salvage. Unlike Saint Joan, who cries out to Jesus, the Queen of Hearts is silent as the fire consumes her. Her body disintegrates completely except for the faint outline of a cross, either a cross or a swastika, there on the busted pavement. And this last one, she's in Mexico, Yucatan Peninsula. Queen of Hearts busts north from Guatemala through Belize into Quintana Roo, the eastern portion of the Yucatan Peninsula. She got off at Akumal, just north of the Maya ruins of Tulum. Fanning south from Cancun, she avoided the tourist hotels. She rented a room in a tiny pension in the low-lying jungle. Gazing through the small cracked window of her room at dusk, she saw 19 toucans in single file, one after the other, flying languidly from the west to the east side of the jungle. Someone said there were alligators in the mangroves. The Queen of Hearts lay nude in a mangrove swamp in the jungle denseness. The next day she bussed to Cancun, checked into Hotel Jesus Intercontinental, which was also a theme park. She bathed, made herself beautiful, and that evening at 7:45, she mounted the 6-story Mary Mother of God barn filled with theme rides and recreations. She launched herself into the moist salt air. She lay sprawled, exposed and bloody on the turf below. This is about John Coltrane visiting Nagasaki. I call it train, T-R-A-N-E. When John Coltrane visited Nagasaki in 1966, Nagasaki had not recovered emotionally from the US atom bomb attack 3 days after the US bombed Hiroshima in August 1945. When the car transporting John and Alice Coltrane pulled up to the greeting area in Nagasaki, Alice got out, but Train stayed in the car playing notes on the flute. The Japanese host looked into the car and asked him what he was doing. John Coltrane whispered that he was trying to find the right music to commemorate Nagasaki. Later, a Japanese jazz fan asked Coltrane an odd question. What do you expect to be 10 years from now? Train answered at once, a saint. John Coltrane died the following year, 40 years old. James Baldwin. James Baldwin wrote about African Americans having 2 languages. The enforced artificial language with whites in formal situations, and the crucial language with like minds, which meant in nearly every instance like color. The like minds language was creative, musical, intense. It also resembled, to Baldwin, inmates sending tap-tap codes to one another in adjoining cells. Once the man decoded the code, the inmates would change it to regain their privileged space. In a, so to speak, non-prison environment, African Americans, especially young African Americans, speak several languages. The rhythmic way he or she walks, the way they dance, the way the young man wears his cap. The baseball cap was worn back to front, but once Whitey caught on and started wearing his cap back to front, the black young man wore his sideways. And when Whitey started doing that, the young black man resumed wearing it front to back. Same sequence with acrobatic breakdancing, and perhaps, strangest of all, rap. That rap became as flexible a musical format as it did was a surprise. But that rap is now copied, mostly ineptly, throughout the globe is the biggest surprise. And again, a testament to the resourceful ingenuity of the African-American musician social activists who created rap from an amalgam of inspirations, such as Caribbean calypso and urban trash talk. I see elements of that secret language even in the acrobatic dunks in basketball. I'm among hoops viewers who prefer to see athletic high style like dunks and ball handling rather than manic win at all costs. When a young black athlete is censured for paying too much attention to hot dogging and not enough attention to winning, my first response is, style is beauty, win at all costs is capital. Fundamentally, I see this multi-pronged African-American language as a socialized resistance to and defiance of the long suffering that commenced with the slave trade. You notice that the cover has this flat iron, this very strange and I think wonderful sculpture that Man Ray did So I have a very short text on the genesis or the apparent genesis of that flat iron. There are two options that I speak about. One option has to do with the composer and musician Eric Satie, S-A-T-I-E, who was very well liked by his compatriots. And Man Ray just met him and liked him immediately. That's one option. Anyway, the genesis of Man Ray's inspirational flat iron with brass tacks glued in a column down the center include these two options. Man Ray had another sculpture prepared for an impending exhibition in a Paris gallery, which was stolen. Without forethought, he bought what he needed in a hardware store and assembled le cadeau in 45 minutes in the store itself, cadeau meaning gift. Second option. Man Ray had just met and befriended the charming Eric Satie and decided on the moment to present Satie with a gift. Seemingly without forethought, Man Ray went into the nearest hardware store in Montmartre and purchased a flat iron, brass tacks, and a tube of glue, which he assembled in half an hour on the spot. Satie received le cadeau with grace and an admiring chuckle. Here's something about Ted and Sylvia. Very short, like the others. Their doomed, inspirational marriage, both of those things. Wind, slanting rain, North London, 9 p.m. Ted Hughes, or a version of him, is walking rapidly in his thug cap and Macintosh when he sees 50 yards or so in front, another male walking toward him, holding something in his arms. Dog? Child? As they draw close to each other, they stop. The man is holding a small fox in his arms. The men look at each other in the slanting rain. Ted Hughes and the small fox look at each other. Hughes smells vaguely the appealing stink of the fox. The man says to Hughes, "Do you want her? Just 5 quid." Hughes looks at the man, then at the small fox. Were he to purchase the fox, it would be off to the wild where he or his shadow wishes to be. Instead, he shakes his head no, hurries down to the tube, back to Sylvia, 18 Rugby Street, Bloomsbury. Except she is not there. She is lurching through the frozen streets to the public phone, calling again and again, not getting an answer. 4 p.m., Highgate, North London, wind, rain. Ted Hughes, or a version of him, in his Macintosh and thug cap, is hurrying past a construction site and in the filthy weather does not hear the repeated recorded warning, "Mind the gap, mind the gap." Usually sure-footed, Hughes slips and plummets deep and hard back to Sylvia, 18 Rugby Street, Bloomsbury. Except she is not there. She is lurching through the frozen streets to the public phone, calling again and again, not getting an answer. But this text is a little bit more rhetorical, though also short, as all of them are. It's called No, Not No. Sylvia Plath was attacked because she compared her emotional pain to the Holocaust with a capital H. Susan Sontag observed that while the Soviets were everywhere advertised as the arch enemy of capitalism, capitalism adored the Nazis because they were charismatic, like sharks and serial killers. Elizabeth Costello, Kitsea's protagonist in The Lives of Animals, insists that the meat slaughtering industry is equivalent to the Holocaust with a capital H. When a writer asked Kafka how he was faring, Kay's response was, "I consider it a blessing to simply stand in the corner and breathe." Crazy Horse, Sioux warrior and priest, was murdered young. He didn't permit himself to be photographed. His burial place has never been revealed. About William Blake, who distrusted the French, Bataille said, "He was a man who never pursed his lips." Simone Weil said in 1940, as countries were knuckling under to fascism, that she felt as if the center were shredding. We are in 2021. The center has shredded. Simone Weil is a figure who interests me a good deal. She's hard to read. She did everything at a very young age. She was that precocious. I'd like to read something about her. These are all written in single sentences. Most of them are just single lines to call attention somewhat to the style. Simone Weil felt compelled to swallow the sputum from an impoverished tubercular patient. She was admitted to the prestigious École Normale Supérieure with the highest test scores in her class. Simone de Beauvoir scored second highest. After graduating with honors in philosophy, she became a teacher in various girls' lycées in remote areas of France. Because of her persistent involvement in workers' demonstrations, she was transferred from lycée to lycée. Simone Weil abandoned teaching. She ceased communication with friends and colleagues. Though sickly, she worked in factories to experience firsthand the deprivation of ordinary people. Through the intervention of a Dominican priest, she found arduous physical work on a farm in the Ardèche. At the same time, she set about learning Sanskrit, the classical language of the Hindus. Wherever she was, she lived ascetically, fasting, sleeping on a straw pallet, reading by candlelight. Though her family were secular, upper middle class Jews, progressive and charitable, Simone Weil was unceasingly critical of Judaism and the Old Testament. Adversaries labeled this Jewish self-hatred, but that would unjustly discredit an extraordinary, if radically eccentric, humanist whose most intimate identification was with Jesus. As a child, Simone Weil would eat sparingly in honor of the hungry poor. She went to Mass regularly and yearned to imitate Christ, but she would not convert to Roman Catholicism, she proclaimed, so long as the Vatican privileged wealth and status. She abandoned her pacifism and traveled to Spain in 1936 to fight with the people against Franco. Her family, including her mathematically gifted brother and Simone Weil herself, managed to escape Vichy France and settle in New York in 1942, but she returned to Europe only a few months later to join the Free French Resistance headquartered in London. Until April 1943, she wrote polemical anti-fascist reports and essays for the Free French. In that year, she entered a hospital in Kent, where she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She refused to eat out of respect for the starving multitudes throughout war-torn Europe. Thus, she commits suicide by starvation and is buried in a small grave in Ashford, Kent, on August 24th, 1943, 34 years old. Simone Weil wrote these prophetic words toward the end of her brief life. Unless supernatural grace intervenes, there is no form of cruelty or depravity of which ordinary decent people are not capable once the corresponding psychological mechanisms have been set in motion. I'm looking, we still have time. Well, I want to read something brief about Pasolini, P-A-S-O-L-I-N-I, the Italian film director. He was also a poet, communist, homosexual, finding it difficult to exist in mid-century, Italy. But he did something at the end of his life that was talked about, but only several years after he died, and it interested me a good deal, to read about that speculation. So this is quite short. About Pier Paolo Pasolini, a contemporary said he was compelled to live life dangerously in every sense. This passionate, brilliant, contradictory man. Filmmaker, poet, novelist, Marxist, homosexual, living and trying to love in mid-century Italy. See the shining, contradictory facets in his remarkable face. All angles pointed one way beautiful, another way pitiful, a third way saintly. Pasolini visited the ragazzi, poor boys in the slums on the outskirts of Rome, paid them for allowing him to love them. After years of these regular visits, one Sunday, he met friends for luncheon, seemed more or less as usual, phoned his mother with whom he lived, then drove to the outskirts of Rome. In the next reel, he is found dead, his trousers at his knees, his testicles crushed, his face and body burnt with violent wheel marks over it. The official finding concluded that Pasolini visited his ragazzi, antagonized them somehow, after which they murdered him savagely, driving his car back and forth over his burnt dead body. Years later, a theory floated. Pasolini deliberately provoked his sordid murder to demonstrate the dread meaning of life, employing himself as shaman. I believe that strange story, and in truth, I admire it. I think of other figures who might get themselves murdered to demonstrate a principle. Rimbaud comes to mind, Simone Weil, Lorca, Artaud, John Coltrane, Vincent van Gogh, of course. I want to read something about Clarice Lispector. Especially the ending. If I were in touch with the students, I would ask them to read it with me, part of it, but I'll read it myself. It's fine. The American poet Elizabeth Bishop, living in Brazil in the 60s, wrote to her colleague Robert Lowell about an exceptionally gifted Brazilian writer who, though was very skittish, seemingly nervous about human contact. She was referring to Clarice Lispector, who wasn't Brazilian by birth. Clarice was born in the Ukraine to a Jewish family that moved to Brazil to escape the pogroms when she was an infant. In her early 20s, Clarice married a Brazilian diplomat and for the next decade and a half traveled in Europe. She returned to Brazil after her divorce in 1959, where she lived and wrote until her untimely death in 1977. Because Lispector often wrote about the poor and dispossessed, as in Hour of the Star, Passion According to GH, and in her weekly newspaper column, Crônicas, there is the impression that she was progressive, a compassionate heart-mind artist. That is true and untrue. In Hour of the Star, which features the homely, impoverished Maccabea, Lispector writes movingly on Maccabea's behalf, but also with a cruel irony against her, that is, on behalf of the cruel culture that ignores or destroys the vulnerable poor. Lispector writes similarly in her Crônicas, published weekly in a Brazilian newspaper for nearly 2 years, Crônicas, Cronicas. It is as if shaman-like, Lispector inhabits the cruel cultural position to interrogate that position from the inside out, except the interrogation never quite develops. In her difficult, strangely meditative fiction, nonfiction book, Passion According to GH, the white protagonist is, for unclear reasons, at odds with the Black Brazilian woman who works as the protagonist's maid, then abruptly leaves, having deposited a symbolic anti-colonialist mural on the wall of her small room. The protagonist, closely resembling Lispector, remains in the room and proceeds to have a mostly hostile dialogue with a cockroach, the insect at least partially representing the absconded Black maid. Lispector's recent biographer, Benjamin Moser, argues that the author became involved in witchcraft. Clarice was interested in witchcraft, which has a presence in the poor areas of Brazil, but she was far from involved in it. There is something about the nature of her intuition, its volatility, its unpredictability, that resembles witchcraft. Lispector is a mosaic of seemingly opposing attitudes and sensibilities, instant mood changes without psychological reflection. That is the crux. Clarice's visionary ability is evocatively outside her control, which is how she prefers it. That uncontrollable faculty appears to offer her some protection. One can see it in her person. In the few interviews that have been recorded, she has a remote beauty about her face, and her talk is disembodied, as if she is speaking out of a dream or vision. Ordinarily, when a human possesses this quality, it has been honed by meditation or devotion of some kind. With Clarice, it appears otherwise. Her Cassandra-like intuitions have an ejaculatory rawness about them. She writes in her Chronicas that exceptional human beings are more exposed to danger than ordinary people. Hence that skittishness that Elizabeth Bishop remarked in her letter to Robert Lowell. Clarice's 1973 quasi-novel, translated as Agua Viva, as her avid admirer Hélène Cixous puts it, is a narrative without a spine. One reads it in a circle, Cixous says, and has to leap to follow insofar as following is the point. What follows is a clause catalog from Clarice's narrative without a spine. Mine is a story of instants. The oblique life is very intimate. I live sideways. My days are a single climax. Mine is a fury of impulses. I am pure. I am intrinsically bad. I write to you in disorder. We must respect our cruelty. Life is a strip of pavement over an abyss. I work while I sleep. My extraordinary gift for succumbing to fear. I must remember what never existed. I never feel compassion in the spring. I have opened my hands and heart and am losing nothing. I demand an invented truth. I don't know what I'm writing about. There is only one fury that is blessed, the fury of those who suffer privation. The greatest drawback to writing is having to use words. My preference is for harsh opposites. We no longer know how to receive grace. My concern is missing the news that comes in dream. A complete self is a non-self. My solitude holds in its grasp the grief of others. I look after the world. All right, I think I'll stop there. That's about 45 minutes, and looking forward to talking with you a little bit.
Yes, thank you so much, Hal, for all those great selections. Feel free to, if you want to hear a real clap, go ahead and unmute yourself. So we're pretend like we're in room 430.
Wow.
Well,
I know. I think we missed that about the virtual thing. Is we don't hear that applause that you so well deserve.
all immaterial now.
Yes. So we're ready for some questions now. If you have a question for Hal, please feel free to use the little hand raise function, or you can throw it into the chat.
It is Robert Cross. Yeah, Robert.
Hey, obviously I've read your book a few times. So behind me is a piece by Dubuffet, and I wanted you to speak on him and his impact on why you chose the title BRUT and the how it ties into everything that you write about in the actual text with Artaud.
Yeah, thank you. No, BRUT, as Dubuffet, who was a painter, and he coined the term to refer to what he's referring to in 1949. He was referring to institutionalized mental patients who were producing art. And the art often was extraordinary. It was especially painting and drawings, less often writing. And he became very interested in it and collected, a number of canvases. And the notion of art brut spread very rapidly because it was saleable. And now you hear outsider art and even folk art described as a kind of art brut. I'm interested in it because of my notion about, call it the violent imaginer. When you think of an imagination such as Dostoevsky had, such as Kathy Acker has, such as in his way Kafka had, and others, you recognize that to some extent it's confluent with madness. And they both proceed in the same way, although at the last minute, the violent imaginer moves centripetally, and the person who's accounted mad moves centrifugally. Now, sometimes the violent imaginer doesn't move centripetally and moves in the same direction as the person accounted mad. The difference is that the violent imaginer, the person who possesses this violent imagination, can usually right himself or herself and regain his or her emotional equilibrium, whereas the person accounted mad, can't generally. As I mentioned to somebody recently, I use the verb accounted deliberately to point to the fact that it's usually the poor who are institutionalized. The people with money and status have private care, to take care of them. Well, because I guess I might as well confess to you that I consider myself a violent imaginer. I've always been interested in art brut, and I've never felt the sense of it somehow pulling me in. A lot of people are frightened of it because they feel there's a contagion there or some sort of whirlpool effect. I've never felt that. I've always felt pretty much at home in it. So I've paid very close attention to what painters and people who draw do. It came out from one of the LA museums of art, which had, it was a divided sort of vision. On one side, it had canonical art, Klee, Kandinsky, Dubuffet, Picasso, Frida Kahlo, etc. On the other side, it had people who were doing art brut, who were institutionalized. And in every instance, the canonical artist envied them because they could, as in Blake's Holy Thursday, where the children, once they're in St. Paul's Cathedral, their voices mount high above the vaulted ceiling. The notion was that there was no social distancing. There was no social difficulty with people accounted mad soaring. They could soar, whereas people who lived in socially constructed worlds, as we do, weren't permitted to soar, beyond a certain limit. The problem is they could also plummet. And it was the plummeting that's particularly frightening. But many artists, even artists you wouldn't expect, like Paul Klee, for example, Giacometti, well, in Giacometti's instance, you might expect it, said that they would accept the plummeting if they could have the soaring, of somebody who's accounted mad. So that's a quick rundown of it's always mattered to me in my work, and that's the reason I call it. The last text, which I haven't read, is rather difficult because I take, it's not really difficult, but I wrote it very unconsciously. Well, I wrote it more unconsciously than probably I've written anything in a very long time. I take words from Artaud's notebooks, and I simply comment on them, not knowing quite what I'm saying. For example, this is Artaud. The wound, the dreadful hollowness of the paralyzed self. Black Elk, the Oglala Sioux shaman, resisted his prophetic dreams, as did Cassandra, whose fate was to be prophetic but discredited. An unwanted martyrdom, which moreover is unacknowledged, though not absolutely. Christ lives in Art Brut, and so does the heart of Mahayana Buddhism. Moments of a sour savor while buried alive. Anyway, I'm commenting on it in quite various ways. It was, even though I recognize Artaud's pain, it was fun for me to write. Artaud didn't want his writings to outlive him. He wanted actually a projection of his wasted, tormented body to embody the language and everything he did during his life that was considered creative. Not the work, but the body. That's what he wanted. And so we see lots and lots of pictures of Artaud, particularly when he was older, though he wasn't very old, and also when he was young and beautiful, you know, but he lost that very rapidly. Well, that's my response, Mark. Thank you for the question.
Hal, I kind of have a follow-up question to that, just because we're in the space of kind of defining Art Brut, you know, and the brute artist as a violent imaginer. And a lot of these pieces, and some of the ones that you read this evening, like Train and Pasolini, Weil, words come up repeatedly, like saint, savior, shaman. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to maybe the connection of these words or these ideas to Art Brut.
Yeah, and of course, you know, they come out of pain and they come out of compassion. And they come out of not averting your eyes. You know, once you refuse to avert your eyes, you're compelled to see pain and even to witness it and even to some extent to inhabit it. But if you don't avert your eyes, then you're doing something that's hurtful, you know, to too many people who are suffering, too many creatures, you know, who are suffering. So a lot of these people, you know, in terms of psychology, I believe, you know, mostly in R.D. Laing and the idea. And some of these people who are accounted mad were simply walking point for the rest of us. You know, they were just feeling the pain sooner, you know, the way a frog feels it earlier than other amphibians, you know, and is born distorted and deformed. And then later other amphibians are. So I think of the person who's accounted mad as somebody sometimes inadvertently, often inadvertently, who takes this chance to not avert his or her eyes, you know, and I think that's the dialectic between being mad and being visionary. In some instances, you know, Laing doesn't insist that everybody has a breakdown is really a breakthrough. Sometimes there are organic reasons, but often there aren't. Often there aren't.
Thank you. All right, what other questions do we have? Remember, you can use a little hand raise function, throw them into the chat. Let's start with Sean.
Hey, Hal, thanks. Hey, Hal, by the way, congratulations on the new book. I love just listening to this. I feel like I'm in class with you again. It's so great. You know, this Art Brut, you've been talking about this. You know, this is something that we've talked about in your classes for years. I think of like Tom Phillips and the Humument and the Henry Darger paintings. And I'm wondering why now? Why write a book now about Art Brut, which has been around for a long time? Is there anything with the timing, like right now in 2021? I know we've also talked, Hal, about what is it? Algorithms, people thinking in algorithms and how culture has changed. And I'm wondering if it has something to. I'm wondering if it has something to do with that too. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes,
Thanks.
It does, absolutely. You know, I think you know, Mother Earth is perishing, you know, and algorithm is not in a position to deal with it. You know, it takes compassion and heart mind. You're not going to do it with applied mathematics. in a way, and there are too many people who are suffering, and there are too many animals who are suffering. And so I think now particularly is important to turn toward them and to do what you can. I mean, you know, this is, you know, BRUT is featured in a lot of my works. I just haven't called it that. Sometimes I have, but I just haven't called it that. But it's to some extent, it's been there for a long time. But yeah, I think this is a special time because there's terminus in the air. And there's an extraordinary amount of acting out. You know, there's a kind of mania, there's a kind of violence and stupidity, deliberate stupidity that you wouldn't ordinarily see if there was a sense of historical continuity. But there isn't now. And even people, young people who don't acknowledge it, you know, are acting as if they believe it. I mean, you see these movies, popular movies about zombies and bots, and you know there's something in the air, even though a lot of it is just copying, you know, from various memes and so on. But yeah, I think now is the crucial time, you know, because we're seeing it happening right in front of us. You know, Mother Earth is dying. You know, countries are being overwhelmed. I mean, it was 5 years ago where Bangladesh, you know, the rice paddies were overwhelmed. And that's why a lot of the Bangladeshi people, the Rohingya Muslims, you know, went to Myanmar because they couldn't do anything in Bangladesh anymore. And that's part of the reason they were having such a problem with the Hinayana Buddhists there in Myanmar, you know, because they left. There were Rohingya Muslims already, but many more, you know, more than 1 million, you know, came from Bangladesh. So the world is perishing. And I think there are people who are suffering more than other people, as there are creatures who are. And my notion is, insofar as one can, to turn to them. You know, whether that means protests and what shape the protest should be. I like Greta Thunberg and the protests that she was mounting. You know, but pandemic got in the way, and all the mothers pulled the little, you know, the young girls aside because, you know, they didn't want them to get sick. But I liked very much what she was doing, and certainly I like what Black Lives Matter is about. I wanted to deal a little bit more with Malcolm X, you know, and to think in terms of. I think we have to do that. I don't think Martin Luther King has all the answers. You know, that's the reason when Nina Simone shook hands with Martin Luther King, she said, "One thing I have to tell you, you know, I don't feel, I don't think that violence should be out of the question, you know, when we're dealing with this kind of racial hatred." I agree with that.
Thanks, Hal. I kind of have a, let's see. Okay, yeah, and this was, I wanted to talk about just the selection of artists that you chose, because I imagine there's several that you might have written that you maybe had to leave out. Veronica asked in the chat, one of the students from Living Writers said, of all the artists you included, do you have a favorite?
No, I never think in those terms at all. I included artists in every sense except for John Berger, who experienced great pain, emotional pain that they were able to transfigure into beauty, into a certain kind of beauty. But this is important. It was a beauty that pointed outward. But it wasn't simply a kind of solipsistic, you know, onanistic beauty. It was a beauty that had to do with people in pain. It pointed outward always, you know, like Simone Weil, for example. You know, like Nina Simone, you know, for example, like Baldwin, you know, for example. This pointing outward, this feeling the pain, which you're transfiguring, but you're transfiguring into a kind of beauty that's designed to be of use to people who have nothing or very close to nothing. Yeah, I could have picked any number of other people. And because I'm a restless writer and I tend to go from, you know, to move from one thing to another, I wouldn't do a sequel to this. You know, I think I've done what I could here, and you know, I'm already writing performances now, and I'd like to do a book of that, and then who knows? Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, but thank you. No, that's a reasonable question, of course.
right, what other questions do we have? Remember, you can use the little hand raise. I'm trying to check through our list to make sure I don't miss anybody.
Yeah, please talk to me.
Yeah, so I was, you said you wanted to write, or now maybe you're currently writing like a collection of performances. We were particularly drawn to the performance pieces in the text, like Tuxedo and Glory Hole. So can you maybe talk through a little bit about the decision to maybe intersperse those with the other more biographical pieces? And
right. Yeah, I like the speed of it. I like the instruction aspect of it, even though it's, sometimes it's something that's inconceivable that you can't do. It's figurative. It's not literal. But I think it's an interesting way of saying what's on your mind in a powerful, artistic, and condensed way. It has a long history. In my classes where we were talking about Yoko Ono, way before she met John Lennon, 1960 even, because, Yoko now is 87. She was writing these performances, but very fast and very small, short ones. She wasn't doing anything that pointed outward. But Yoko did some nice things, and I have a lot of admiration for her. But she wasn't really looking out until later, when she and John Lennon did the Peace Lions, where they for their honeymoon they stayed in bed and spoke about peace, to the public and so on. So yeah, I like the speed. I like how quickly I could say things artistically. And I think now is the time for that, because people don't want to read anything lengthily. There was a time, 1988, where I wrote a book which probably had 3 periods in it. The rest was just writing, about Madonna. And some people, and even, fancy journals and newspapers responded to it. Couldn't possibly do anything like that now, because young people don't want to spend that kind of time. And they're also not familiar with the references, because they've read so little. So I think performance is a good thing to do now. I think it could be useful to reach some people. That's pretty much what I'm thinking.
Well, thank you. I might want to come back to that, because I have another question about a sort of response to what's happening in our current moment, the center being shredded. But we'll put a pin in that, because Ethan, one of my students, has a great question in the chat too. It's kind of a 2-parter. He says, do you think that people project more meaning to these artists because they can empathize with the person's pain? And also, do you think that pain gives people a certain perspective that can't be attained without experiencing pain oneself?
Yeah, well, certainly the second, I'd say absolutely, yes. There are some sensitive people who could experience it from a bit of a distance, but no, you have to inhabit it. The first question, could you repeat that again, please?
Yeah. So do you think people project more meaning to these artists because they can empathize with that person's pain?
No, I don't think people see it that way. I think most readers, when they're reading, well, certainly Sylvia Plath is an exception. When they're reading Clarice Lispector, let's say, or when they're reading even Baldwin, I don't think they think so much of their pain as what they've written. I don't know whether that kind of empathy, that ability to think, first of all, in order to, I write about Melville and Hawthorne. I mean, in order to have any feeling about them, you have to have read them. And most young people aren't going to be reading Melville very carefully now. I mean, there are other things to read that are shorter, and quicker. So I don't think they know enough, generally speaking, you know, to have this kind of empathy, because this kind of empathy is a bit intimate. You know, certainly with Kafka, you could feel that. And Sylvia Plath, I mean, if you've read Ariel, you know, you could see that her work dialectically gets stronger and stronger as she gets closer to killing herself. You know, you could see the, you know, all the hindrances are being loosened, you know, because there's nothing there but extraordinary pain and beauty. But other than that, I think it's very difficult for most readers to think in those terms, because they haven't been in position to read closely enough or intimately enough. I think that, you know, like most people of my vintage, you know, I think it's too bad, but I think it's inevitable, you know. Yeah, Ren.
So Hal, in that sense, are people with privilege doomed? In other words, Simone Weil's statement that unless some supernatural force intervenes, we are doomed to hurt each other. So how do people with privilege, how do we accomplish this?
Yeah, I understand. Well, actually, she said we're capable. You know, people are capable of any number of things once the right psychological mechanisms have been set in order. I mean, we see that, you know, with World's End, you know, I think the craziness, the violence, you know, the untrammeled hate, you know, wouldn't exist in the same way were it not for that sense that the world is foreshortened, you know, that history is stopping, you know, that humankind is going to be erased. You know, people are speaking about that, and mostly in intelligent places, you know, very openly. So she feels that when the right psychological mechanisms are there, you know, we're liable to see it, and we're seeing it now. You know, with you know, the simplest kinds of things, which have to do with the most basic sort of sympathies, are being abandoned. You know, we know how much power money has, but not like we're seeing it now. I mean, the cynicism, you know, the easy lies and so on are in a sense unprecedented. In a sense, you know, I mean, overall. So I mean, wouldn't you say, Rin, yourself, that that we're seeing a level of rage and hate that we haven't seen for a very long time?
Wow, such a deep question. I think that the outcasts, the oppressed, the brute, the art brute people of which you talk, the folks in the mental institutions of the past, they by nature they are forced to go to these places where they learn the meaning, right? And some of them are able to then express that in their work, their art, paintings, drawings, and things. I would also say that like them, those that are oppressed by society, and those who are outcast and sent to the margins by social construct, they are by necessity forced to learn what the meaning is. And I'm wondering and I'm hoping that they can be that supernatural force that Simone Weil suggests would be the intervention or would redeem those of us with privilege. That's my hope.
Well, sure, no, mine too. That's the reason I was so happy to see Greta, you know, with the sign that she'd have every Friday. We won't let our parents shit on our future, you know, in English. She was Swedish, as you know, she is Swedish. And I love that movement because it was pre-electronic. And you had adolescent girls primarily with some boys expressing themselves. As I said, it was out of Blake. I even wrote something about Blake and Greta. But then the pandemic came, and parents were nervous about their children. But yeah, no, I think that's the hope, and there's some sense of it. There's some sense of it. This was asked of what's his name? He was the tallest man in the United States cabinet, and he was the professor of economics and in JFK. And they asked him. Somebody asked him suddenly, what is it going to take for America and this was like 1965, after JFK was assassinated. Well, what is it going to take for America to grow up, and to see things in a mature way, and to have some, and to value the kinds of things that need to be valued? And he thought about it, and he said, maybe a concatenation, I remember he used that word, of 3 catastrophes, one after another, would shake people, and get them to think and feel. That's been changed because of electronics, because you have that concatenation, but it's turned into entertainment. I mean, we've talked about this. Think about Fukushima, for example. It's been going on. They're dumping still thousands of gallons of radiated water into the Pacific, but we don't think about that. It's if it's online. I mean, there are any number of things, that previous to electronics, would amount to, a tragedy that might shake some of us, but now it's transformed into entertainment very rapidly, or into a form of entertainment. So you can't tell the difference because it's formatted the same way, with the like and, so on, and comments. So yeah, no, I have the same hope that you do, Ren.
Thank you. That was instructive, a conversation. Thanks, Ren, for your question. So I think we might end with coming back to that pin that I had mentioned, because how in our class session, we kind of talked at length about the title piece, BRUT, in the collection. And the idea of the sovereign response to an insupportable world, right? So it talks about how Van Gogh's sovereign response was severing his ear. And while we definitely, don't want to purport that as a sovereign response at this point, I do feel as though, as we've talked about already during the session, that, we are living in an insupportable world, right? Where the center has shredded. So think about living through a plague, essentially, right? The murder of unarmed Black Americans by police, acts of hate against Asian Americans, right? Global warming. So all of these things that are sort of shredding our experiences, right? This insupportable world. So what do you think, and this is probably a very loaded question, as artists, what could be a sovereign response to this insupportable world? Like, what can we do, or make as artists in response?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. A sovereign in that sense was first used by Georges Bataille, where he had a very curious way of defining it. But it always had to do with unexpected responses. It didn't really have to do with empathy, particularly. I think ideally art has to turn outward. It has to maintain, its passion. It has to even increase the passion, and not be patronizing. Not dumb it down, but turn outward. And deal with subject matter that hasn't been dealt with, and deal with it in a civil way, without patronization. I think that has to be done. In the United States is one of the few countries where an artist like I, for a long time, have been trying to get in touch, trying to get involved in what I call the international discourse. But it's been very hard for me because I'm identified as a writer. And writers in the United States are thought to be aesthetic only. That's not true. I mean, in France, for example, or in Japan, You look at Yukio Mishima, and there are any number of people in France. You know, writers are also thinkers in many instances, and they're allowed into the social discourse. I think that should be changed, you know, and artists, particularly artists who write, because they're in a different position to think. You know, artists who paint, you can't necessarily talk. Sometimes they can. Robert Motherwell, for example, was very articulate. But I think it's pointing outward. I don't know that there's any cure. You know, I agree with Chris Hedges at this point. You know, that there may not be any cure, but I think the people who are feeling the most pain, the creatures who are feeling the most pain, can be tended to. And art can pay attention to that, particularly writing can, but also painting and the plastic arts. Turning outward, I think, is for me one of the keys. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and I mean, I think that's such a adept and beautiful way to describe that process. And I think Anka has a comment in the chat, right? Measure of optimism and fighting against and out of this time when our world is shredding, right? And art that turns outward, I think, is a great place to start. So Hal, I want to thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. You know, we miss this classroom experience, so thank you for replicating that for us this evening. So let's give it up for Hal.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks for your great questions. We really appreciate your participation and for, you know, showing up at this difficult time in the semester where we're prepping for finals. It is nice to get together with our community.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to stop our recording.